In the winter of 1839, a decision was made by a woman in Virginia that would echo through generations like a scream in an empty house. Margaret Whitmore was her name. And what she did behind her plantation's closed doors wasn't just immoral. It was methodical. Not out of passion or madness did she act. She acted with purpose. For 3 years, she conducted an experiment on human beings as if they were livestock, paying strangers in silver coins for things that should have sent her to prison. But Margaret was wealthy. Margaret was white, and in 1839 Virginia, that meant she could get away with almost anything. Enslaved were the people she destroyed. The children born from her scheme grew up not knowing who their fathers were, knowing only that they existed because someone had been paid to create them. A ghost story this is not. This is real. And for nearly 200 years, it's been buried. Hello everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel, leaving a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Into cruelty, Margaret Whitmore wasn't born. She was born into comfort. Over 400 acres of tobacco land in Louisa County, Virginia were owned by her father. And when she married Thomas Whitmore in 1821, that land she brought with her like a dowry made of soil and suffering. Thomas was older, respected, and allegedly impotent. More than anyone realized at the time, that last detail would matter. 4 years, the Whitmores lived quietly. Church they attended. Dinners they hosted. They smiled at their neighbors, pretending everything was normal. But children were what Margaret wanted, not because she loved them. No evidence exists that she ever showed affection to a single child in her life, but because heirs were what children meant, and the land staying in the family was what heirs meant. Without them, everything she had would dissolve into the hands of distant cousins or the state. So she began to think, and monstrous was what she thought of. By 1836, Margaret had come to a conclusion that most people would never dare to speak aloud, let alone act upon. If her husband couldn't give her children, someone else would, but not through affair or divorce, nothing so public, nothing so scandalous. What she was planning wasn't just rape by proxy. It was industrial. It was calculated. And in the spring of 1839, she set it in motion. Margaret began placing advertisements. Not in the local papers, she wasn't stupid, but through quiet word of mouth in taverns, inns, and hiring houses where drifters and day laborers gathered. Simple was the message. A wealthy woman in Louisa County was willing to pay cash for a service that required discretion. No names, no questions, just money in exchange for doing exactly what she asked. The kind you'd expect were the men who responded. Farm hands between jobs, gamblers down on their luck, men with debts and no morals and nothing to lose. In person she met them, always alone, always at dusk in the woods near the edge of her property. A coin purse she would hand them, explaining the terms. To a specific cabin they would go. What she paid them to do, they would do, and then they would leave and never come back. Some of them asked questions, most didn't. The ones who hesitated, she paid more. The ones who agreed too quickly, she paid less. A mind for business Margaret had, even when the business was evil. Jacob Lyle was the name of the first man she hired. He was 23 years old, red-haired, and owed money to a man in Richmond who'd threatened to break his legs. $12 Margaret gave him, more than a month's wages for most laborious, and told him which cabin to go to. Inside that cabin was Rose. 16 years old she was. On the Whitmore plantation she had been born, having never known freedom. When Jacob Lyle walked through that door, Rose didn't scream. She didn't fight because she had been told by Margaret herself that if she resisted, she would be sold south to the sugar fields of Louisiana, where life expectancy was measured in years, not decades. So silent Rose stayed, and when it was over, Jacob Lyle walked out into the night, $12 richer, and Rose lay in the dark, trying to disappear inside her own mind. Like a farmer tracks the weather, Margaret tracked her cycle. And 9 months later, a boy was born to Rose. Margaret named him Thomas after her husband. The birth she recorded in her personal ledger, not the county records. The mother's name and the date she wrote, but where the father's name should have been, she wrote only the Whitmore lineage. A lie it was, but a lie no one would challenge. In Virginia in 1840, A white woman's word was law, and an enslaved woman's truth didn't exist. In the quarters the boy was raised, not the house. Him, Margaret never held, never sang to him, never even looked at him for longer than it took to confirm he was healthy. But she owned him, and that was all that mattered. Because in her mind, this child, born of rape, born of payment, born of a transaction she orchestrated, was hers. That ledger still exists today, locked away in a university archive in Virginia, and the few historians who've seen it describe it as one of the most chilling documents in American history. Divided into columns is each page: date, name of the woman, amount paid, outcome. In neat, slanted handwriting, the kind taught to wealthy girls in finishing schools, she wrote. In those pages, there's no remorse. No hesitation, just numbers and names and clinical observations, as if she were breeding horses instead of destroying human lives. By 1841, 4 women on the Whitmore plantation had given birth to children they never chose to conceive, and nearly $60 had been spent by Margaret on her experiment, a fortune at the time. But something began to go wrong. Not morally, Margaret had no moral compass to break. Practical was what went wrong. People were starting to notice. Enslaved communities talked. Their own networks they had, their own ways of passing information from plantation to plantation, hidden in songs and quilts and midnight conversations. That something evil was happening at the Whitmore place, word spread. That women were being used in ways even slavery didn't usually permit. And while white society didn't care what happened to enslaved women, scandal they did care about. Reputation they cared about, and Margaret's neighbors were beginning to whisper. One of them, a man named Richard Dalton, owned the plantation adjacent to hers. Strange men coming and going at odd hours, he had seen. Rumors from his own enslaved workers he had heard, who'd spoken to people from the Whitmore estate. No abolitionist was Dalton. 37 people he owned himself, but he was suspicious, and suspicion in a place like Louisa County could be dangerous. Questions Dalton began asking. Quietly at first, then more openly. To his wife he mentioned it, who mentioned it to her sister, who mentioned it at a church social. The story grew legs. It twisted and multiplied the way stories do when they're told in whispers. Some versions claimed Margaret was running a brothel. Others said she was practicing witchcraft. A few people, closer to the truth than they realized, said she was trying to breed enslaved people like cattle to increase her property value. That last version made people uncomfortable. Not because it was immoral, but because it was too honest. It reminded them of what slavery actually was. And most white Southerners in 1841 preferred not to think about that too clearly. The cruelest threat she could make it was, and it worked. But a weight silence has to it. And eventually that weight becomes too heavy to carry. In the summer of 1842, one of the women, Dina, tried to run. Not far did she make it. Most people who ran never did. By a slave patrol she was caught just outside of Richmond, about 30 miles from the Whitmore plantation. Back in chains they dragged her, her feet bloody, her dress torn, and handed her over to Margaret like a piece of lost luggage. Documented in a letter written by a tutor who worked briefly for the Whitmores is what happened next. Edmund Fairchild was his name, and years later, after he'd moved north and joined an abolitionist society, he wrote about what he witnessed. Dina was whipped by Margaret in front of the other enslaved people. 20 lashes. Then locked in a root cellar for 3 days without food. She had her. When Dina finally emerged, different she was, quieter, hollow. That her eyes looked like windows with no one left inside, Edmund Fairchild wrote. 2 weeks later he left the Whitmore plantation, never to return. Margaret's experiment continued, but the children born from it were growing now. The oldest, Rose's son, Thomas, was nearly 3 years old. In the dirt outside the cabins he played with the other children, unaware that his existence was the result of a transaction, unaware that the woman who owned him had paid a stranger $12 to create him. Almost unbearable to consider is the psychological horror of it. Enslaved these children would grow up, yes, but they would also grow up knowing eventually that they had been manufactured, that their births were not accidents or even the usual cruelties of slavery, but something more deliberate, something colder. And the women, Rose, Dina, Charity, Louisa, had to wake up every single day and see those children and remember. No choice did they have but to love them because they were their children. But every time they looked at them, they also saw the men who'd been paid to violate them. They saw Margaret's face in the doorway watching. They saw the coins changing hands. In 1843, something shifted. Thomas Whitmore, Margaret's husband, died. Pneumonia was the official cause listed, but some historians believe it may have been poison. No proof exists, only the timing, which was awfully convenient for Margaret. With Thomas gone, everything she inherited, the land, the house, the people. 4 heirs, Margaret wasn't doing this anymore. Because she could, she was doing it. Because power she had, and power unchecked becomes its own reason. Because in her world, human beings enslaved people weren't. They were investments. And her return she was maximizing. By 1845, 11 children were owned by Margaret Whitmore, who existed because she had paid men to create them. 11 lives that began in terror and shame, recorded in a ledger like livestock births. But the world was changing around her, slowly, painfully. Strength was gaining by the abolitionist movement in the North. Slave narratives were being published. People like Frederick Douglass were speaking publicly about the horrors of slavery, and their words were reaching places they'd never reached before. Even in Virginia, there were quiet dissenters. Quakers, free black communities, and a few white people whose consciences wouldn't let them sleep at night. About any of them, Margaret wasn't worried. Untouchable she believed she was. And for a long time, she was right. But in the fall of 1845, someone finally tried to stop her. Reverend Samuel Pritchard was his name, and he was the new minister at the church Margaret attended every Sunday. Pritchard was young, idealistic, and recently arrived from Pennsylvania. The rumors about the Whitmore plantation he had heard, and unlike most people, he decided to investigate. Under the pretense of offering spiritual counsel to the enslaved population, Pritchard visited the plantation, a common practice among some clergy at the time. Margaret allowed it, likely because refusing would have looked suspicious, but what Pritchard saw during those visits disturbed him deeply. To the women he spoke. The children he saw, and while no one explicitly told him what had happened, fear kept their mouths shut, he was smart enough to piece it together. The dates, the different fathers, the way Margaret watched those children with a cold, possessive stare. To the county magistrate, a man named Henry Cobb, Pritchard went, telling him everything he suspected. An investigation he demanded. He insisted that what Margaret Whitmore had done was not just immoral, but criminal. Politely, Cobb listened. Then he told Pritchard to go home and mind his own business, because Margaret Whitmore was wealthy, because she was connected to powerful families, and because the women involved were enslaved, which meant they had no legal standing to accuse anyone of anything. In the eyes of Virginia law, no crime existed. Only property and transactions were there, and no laws had been broken by Margaret. Pritchard didn't give up. Letters to abolitionist newspapers in the North he wrote, describing what he believed was happening in Louisa County. A few of those letters were published. A minor stir in anti-slavery circles they caused, but nothing came of it. No one in Virginia cared what Northern abolitionists thought. And Margaret, when she heard about Pritchard's efforts, simply stopped attending his church. A different one she began attending 20 miles away, where the minister knew better than to ask questions. A year later, Pritchard left Virginia, defeated and disillusioned. In his final journal entry before departing, he wrote, "I have seen evil that wears the face of respectability, and I have learned that justice is not blind. It simply looks away when convenient." Margaret continued her experiment until 1847. Then, without explanation, she stopped. No more men were hired. No more children were born under those circumstances. Why, historians don't know. Maybe she'd gotten what she wanted. Maybe she'd grown bored. Or maybe, just maybe, something close to fear she had finally felt. If you're still watching, braver than most you already are. Tell us in the comments. What would you have done if this was your bloodline? Another 23 years, Margaret Whitmore lived. She never remarried. She never left Louisa County, and she never acknowledged what she had done. When the Civil War came in 1861, her world began to collapse. But slowly, like a house sinking into mud. Her crops were requisitioned by Confederate soldiers. Her tobacco barns were burned by Union troops when they finally arrived. And in 1865, when the Emancipation Proclamation was enforced in Virginia, the people she had enslaved walked away. All of them, including the women she had brutalized, including the children she had manufactured. Without looking back they left, and Margaret was left alone in a house that suddenly felt enormous and empty. White laborers she hired to work the fields, but wages they demanded she could barely afford. The plantation, once worth a fortune, began to crumble. By 1868, parcels of land she was selling off just to pay her debts. And in 1870, at the age of 68, Margaret Whitmore died in her sleep, alone, unmourned. The truth about how they were born, some of them knew. Others didn't or refused to believe it. In Richmond, Rose's son Thomas ended up working as a carpenter. He married, had children of his own, and never spoke about his mother or where he came from. To Maryland, Dina's daughter, Clara, moved, changing her name. Her parents had died when she was young, she told people, which wasn't entirely a lie. Spiritually, her mother had died long before her body gave out. Trauma that had no language yet was carried by these people. Psychology as a field barely existed. There was no therapy, no support groups, no way to process what had been done to them and to their mothers. So what traumatized people have always done, they did. They survived. They worked. They loved their own children fiercely, protectively, as if love could somehow undo the evil that had created them, and they passed down fragments of the story, usually in whispers, usually late at night, usually with the warning, never tell anyone outside this family. Margaret's ledger, the one she kept hidden under the floorboard, was discovered in 1889 by a distant cousin who inherited the property after it had changed hands several times. William Hargrove was the cousin's name, and horrified by what he found, he was burning it, he considered, but something stopped him. Maybe he thought it needed to be preserved as evidence. Maybe he thought future generations deserved to know the truth. Or maybe he just didn't know what else to do with it. So, to a local historical society he donated it with the stipulation that it remained sealed for 50 years. In 1939 it was opened, exactly 100 years after Margaret began her experiment. By then, everyone directly involved was dead. The women, the children, the men who'd been paid, even Reverend Pritchard, who tried to stop it, had been buried for decades. But the document remained, cold, clinical, undeniable, and it told a story that Virginia and America had spent a century trying to forget. Today, in exactly 3 academic papers and 1 obscure historical journal, Margaret Whitmore's name appears. No monument has she. No historical marker. The plantation where she conducted her experiment was torn down in the 1950s to make room for a shopping center. A grocery store is where her house once stood and a parking lot where the cabins used to be. Most people who live in Louisa County have never heard of her. And the ones who have don't like to talk about it, because Margaret Whitmore's story isn't just about one evil woman in 1839. It's about a system that allowed her to do what she did without consequence. It's about a society that valued property over people, whiteness over humanity, and wealth over morality. That system, Margaret didn't invent. How to use it, she just understood. And that's what makes her story so disturbing. An anomaly she wasn't. A product she was, a logical extension of slavery's cruelty, stripped of any pretense of paternalism or mercy. As things to be manipulated, she saw human beings, and the law agreed with her. The descendants of those 11 children, the ones born because Margaret paid strangers in silver, are still out there. Their full history, most of them don't know. Some of it has started to be uncovered by DNA testing in recent years. People searching for their roots, trying to understand why their family trees have so many gaps and mysteries, sometimes stumble across the Whitmore ledger in digital archives. And when they do, a truth that's almost impossible to process they are faced with. That their great-great-grandparents existed because of a transaction. That with rape for hire, their bloodline begins. That the woman responsible died wealthy and unpunished. To historians, some of them have reached out. Their own research some have started. A few have tried to connect with each other to form a community of people bound by shared trauma that happened generations ago, but still echoes forward. Easy it is not. Trauma like that doesn't have a statute of limitations. In the body it lives, in the blood, in the stories families tell, and the ones they refuse to tell. Margaret Whitmore believed she could control everything. Untouchable, money and power made her, she believed. And in her lifetime, she was right. But a way of keeping score history has. Her name, when it's mentioned at all, is mentioned with disgust. As examples of slavery's most depraved possibilities, her actions are studied. And the people she tried to reduce to numbers in a ledger, they became ancestors. They became stories. They became proof that humanity can survive even the most calculated evil. Heirs who would carry on her legacy was what Margaret wanted. Instead, survivors who would carry on despite her was what she created. The children she manufactured grew up. Families they had. Lives they built. And their descendants are here today, living, breathing reminders that cruelty doesn't get the last word. Margaret Whitmore is gone, forgotten by most, despised by those who remember, but the people she tried to erase, they're still here. And that might be the only justice this story ever gets. Sometimes a courtroom or a conviction history doesn't give you. Sometimes all you get is this, the knowledge that the victims outlasted the villain. That survival in the end is its own kind of victory. And that the truth, no matter how long it takes, eventually finds its way into the light.